Part 1. First Contact. Fleet Commander Zar'thex of the Korvian Hegemony studied the primitive blue planet rotating on his tactical display with what his species would consider satisfaction, a slight darkening of his primary eye stalks. Preliminary scans confirm the intelligence reports, Commander, his tactical officer chittered. Single unified government, limited space capability, no energy shields, no particle weapons. Their most advanced military technology involves chemical propulsion and kinetic projectiles. Zar'thex's mandibles clicked in amusement. The Korvian Hegemony had conquered 88 star systems in the past 2 centuries. 88 civilizations brought into the fold, their resources allocated to the glory of the hegemony, their populations integrated into the workforce. This would be number 89. Open a communication channel, he ordered. Standard subjugation protocol. The view screen flickered to life, showing a surprised-looking human in some kind of military uniform. The universal translator took a moment to process the language. Relatively simple, only 3,000 commonly used words in this dialect they called English. People of Earth, Zar'thex began, his voice modulated to convey appropriate authority. I am Fleet Commander Zar'thex of the Korvian Hegemony. Your planet has been selected for integration into our civilization. You will surrender within 72 of your hours, or we will be forced to take your world by military action. Respond. The human, who had a nameplate on his uniform which read General Patterson, blinked several times. Hold on a second. He pressed a button. Sir, we're being invaded by aliens. Yes, sir. Right now. No, I'm not joking. I'll transfer you. Zar'thex waited and waited. His tactical officer looked at him questioningly. Perhaps their communication technology is failing, suggested his science officer. Finally, the screen showed a different human, older, wearing an even more elaborate uniform. This is General Marcus Webb, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To whom am I speaking? Zar'thex repeated his declaration of subjugation, adding a bit more menace to his tone. General Webb nodded slowly. I see. Well, that's certainly concerning. I'm going to need to escalate this to the appropriate authorities. Can you call back in, say, 6 hours? We're going to need to convene the Security Council, notify the Secretary General, brief the President. 6 hours? Zar'thex's mandibles spread in disbelief. I have just threatened your entire planet with military conquest. Yes, and that's a very serious matter, which is why we need to follow proper channels. Look, Mr. Zar'thex, was it? I can't just make decisions about planetary surrender without authorization. That's not how this works. I'm sending you the contact information for the State Department's Office of Interplanetary Relations. We established it back in 2028 just in case something like this ever happened. They'll need you to fill out Form XP-14, Declaration of Hostile Intent, and probably Form XP-14B, Specification of Demands. Do you have an email address? Zar'thex stared at the screen. In 88 previous conquests, no civilization had ever asked for his email address. No. This is a military vessel. We have quantum encrypted communication arrays. Okay, that's going to be a problem. Most of our government systems only accept official communications through the established portals. Tell you what, let me connect you with Susan Mendoza at the OIR, Office of Interplanetary Relations. She's very helpful. Hold, please. The screen went blank except for text that read, please hold, in some kind of repetitive auditory pattern the translator identified as music, primitive, designed to prevent anxiety during waiting periods. Zar'thex looked at his tactical officer. Is this normal? No species has ever responded to a subjugation demand with administrative procedures. After 14 minutes, a new human appeared. She had a pleasant expression and was drinking from a container labeled World's Best Bureaucrat. Hello, this is Susan Mendoza, Office of Interplanetary Relations. I understand you're here to invade Earth. I'm going to need to collect some information from you first. Can I get your full name, organization, and the nature of your claim to Earth? 72 hours later, Zar'thex was ready to begin the military assault. His patience with human administrative procedures had reached its limit. All ships assume attack formation, prepare to demonstrate our military superiority by destroying one of their major cities. Commander, his communications officer interrupted. We're receiving an incoming transmission from Earth. Official government channel. Susan Mendoza appeared on the screen again, still smiling. Good morning, Commander. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I've processed your initial declaration, but I'm afraid we can't proceed with your invasion until we receive some additional documentation. Zar'thex's eye stalks quivered with rage. We are about to destroy one of your cities. Yes, and that would be very unfortunate, especially from a paperwork standpoint. You see, any military action taken against Earth requires approval from the United Nations Security Council, and we can't bring this to a vote without a complete threat assessment package. You submitted Form XP14, which was great, but you didn't include the required attachments. Required attachments? Yes. For any threat involving potential loss of life over 100,000 individuals, we need Form XP14C, Detailed Military Capability Statement, Form XP14D, Environmental Impact Assessment of Proposed Military Action, and Form XP14E, Alternative Dispute Resolution Preference. Also, I noticed you didn't initial the bottom of page 3, Section 7B of the XP14. Zar'thex made a gesture that, in Korvian culture, indicated extreme frustration. In response, he received a pop-up notification on his screen. You have been automatically enrolled in the State Department's weekly newsletter. Reply STOP to unsubscribe. This is absurd. We are the Korvian Hegemony. We have conquered 88 worlds. Oh, that's great, Susan said brightly. Then you probably have experience with these forms. Although, and I apologize for this, I'm seeing in our records that the Korvian Hegemony isn't registered with The Hague as a recognized interplanetary state. You're going to need to submit an application for recognition of sovereignty before we can accept any official documentation from you. That's Form SR1, and it requires notarized copies of your articles of organization, proof of territorial claim, and 3-character references from recognized galactic governments. We are currently holding your entire planet at gunpoint. I understand this is frustrating, but without proper recognition, any agreement we make could be challenged in the International Court of Justice, and then we'd all have to do this over again. Nobody wants that. Zar'thex terminated the connection and turned to his second-in-command. Destroy one of their cities. Make it dramatic. That will show them we are serious. Which city, Commander? I don't care. One of the major ones. Select a target with high population density and... His communications officer interrupted again. Commander, we're receiving multiple transmissions from Earth. Different government bodies. They're all asking us to register our choice of target. Part 3. Target acquisition. Administrative hold. The next 3 days were among the strangest in Zar'thex's military career. The humans, it turned out, had objections to every city he selected as a demonstration target. We can't authorize military action against New York, explained a human from something called the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The city is currently in the middle of updating its emergency response grid, and any attack would violate the Active Infrastructure Modification Protection Act. Have you considered Newark? Similar area, much less paperwork. When he selected Tokyo, he was informed that it was protected under the Cultural Heritage Emergency Preservation Act and that any military action would require a 75-year environmental review process. London was in the middle of a census and couldn't accommodate emergency situations until data collection is complete. Cairo was experiencing a heat wave, and additional explosions would exacerbate the urban heat island effect without proper environmental mitigation. Mumbai was hosting an international cricket tournament, and the ICC has very strict venue protection clauses. Sydney was fire season. São Paulo had transit union negotiations happening. Moscow's permits were under review. By the 5th day, Zar'thex's tactical officer approached him hesitantly. Commander, we've received an email from the UN Disaster Coordination Office. They're asking if we'd like to schedule our demonstration attack for a mutually convenient time. They've sent a calendar link. Zar'thex pulled up the calendar. Every date for the next 6 months had a note. March 15th to 20th. Spring break, reduce government staffing. March 21st to 25th. Annual Hazard Review Committee meeting, March 26 to 31. Please allow 5 to 7 business days for post-meeting documentation, and so on indefinitely. This is psychological warfare, Zar'thex muttered. It has to be. Actually, Commander, his science officer said, reviewing the data streams from Earth, I believe this is simply how they operate. I've been monitoring their communication networks. Every interaction follows these same patterns. They have millions of forms, billions perhaps. Their entire civilization appears to operate through cascading systems of permissions, authorizations, and documentation requirements. Zar'thex considered this. Then we'll bypass the system. Direct military assault, no warnings, no negotiations. We'll simply take the planet by force. Excellent idea, Commander. Which landing zones shall we select? Somewhere with strategic value, military bases, government centers, economic hubs. His tactical officer worked for several minutes, then looked up with what might have been concern. Commander, I've identified 12,000 potential landing sites matching those criteria. However, Earth's records indicate that any foreign military force requires landing permits from the respective national aviation authorities, local zoning commissions, and in many cases, homeowners associations. Some locations are currently unavailable due to scheduled weddings, street festivals, or farmers markets. We're not asking permission to invade. Of course not, sir. But according to Earth's legal databases, which I've been analyzing, unpermitted landing could result in our forces being classified as illegal occupants, which would make any subsequent territorial claims invalid under their property law. We might conquer the planet, but not legally own any of it. Zar'thex felt something he had never experienced in his military career, confusion approaching despair. Get me Susan Mendoza. Part 4. The Escalation. I want to speak to your leader, Zar'thex demanded when Susan's smiling face appeared on screen. The highest authority on your planet. Immediately. Oh, of course. I can certainly submit a request for executive audience. That's Form PA-22. You'll need to provide a brief summary of the meeting purpose, under 500 words, please, and 3 alternative dates separated by at least 10 business days. The President's scheduling office typically responds within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6, Zar'thex caught himself. Listen carefully, human. I am going to make this very simple. We want your planet. You clearly cannot defend it. Surrender now, or we will take it by force, regardless of your administrative procedures. Susan's expression became sympathetic. I completely understand your frustration, Commander. Bureaucracy can be really challenging, especially when you're working across different cultural systems. But here's the thing, even if you did successfully invade Earth through military force, you'd still need to establish legal governance, and that requires working within our existing frameworks. Why? Because of the implementation problem. Let me give you an example. Let's say you conquer North America. Great. But now you need to issue orders to the population, right? Those orders need to go through the appropriate channels or nobody will know to follow them. You'd need to interface with about 2,000 different government agencies, each with their own communication protocols, security clearances, and approval workflows. She pulled up a document on her screen. See, this is the Federal Register. It's where official government actions are published. To post anything here, you need an official account, which requires establishing your organization in our government database, which needs IRS registration, which needs articles of incorporation, which need to be filed in an appropriate state jurisdiction. Do you have a primary business address on Earth? No! That's going to be a problem. You can't register an organization without a physical address. You could use a P.O. box, but that's not acceptable for military organizations under the Federal Organizational Registration Act. You'd need an actual building. Then we'll take a building. Sure, but property seizure requires due process. You'd need to file an eminent domain claim, which needs to demonstrate public benefit, which requires an approved organizational mission statement, which brings us back to the registration problem. Zar'thex stared at her. You're saying that even if we conquered your planet by force, we couldn't legally issue orders to your population? Not without proper authorization, no. And honestly, even if you got around that somehow, you'd run into the compliance problem. People follow orders because they come through recognized channels. If you just showed up and started telling people what to do, they'd ask to see your permit, and when you didn't have one, they'd file a complaint, which would trigger an investigation, which would require you to appear at a hearing, which you couldn't do without proper legal representation, which requires passing the bar exam in the relevant jurisdiction. This is insane. It's actually pretty logical once you understand the system. Every rule exists because at some point, someone did something that made everyone else say, "We need a rule about that." After a few thousand years of civilization, you accumulate a lot of rules. Part 5. The Compromise. 3 weeks into the invasion. Zar'thex was seriously considering retirement. His entire fleet sat in orbit around Earth, unable to attack because every target was either protected by some obscure regulation, scheduled for renovation, or hosted an endangered species of tree. His supply lines were stretched thin. The Hegemony High Command was demanding status updates, which he couldn't provide because he'd need to admit that he'd been defeated not by weapons, but by administrative procedures. And worst of all, he'd been added to 147 different email mailing lists. Then Susan Mendoza called with what she described as a potential solution. "Commander, I've been thinking about your situation, and I might have a workaround. What if, instead of conquest, we classified this as a merger?" "A merger?" "Yes, a corporate merger. You see, if the Korvian Hegemony were to acquire Earth through a business transaction rather than military force, we could bypass about 90% of the regulatory hurdles. You'd need to file Form M1, Notice of Intent to Acquire, with the Federal Trade Commission, and there would be an antitrust review, but that's much simpler than invasion paperwork." "You want us to purchase Earth?" "Not purchase exactly. More like absorb it into your organizational structure. The UN could become a subsidiary of the hegemony, maintaining day-to-day operational control while you handle strategic oversight. From your perspective, you'd effectively control the planet. From our perspective, we'd maintain our existing governance structures." Zar'thex felt a headache forming behind his eye stalks. "And this would satisfy your requirements?" "Most of them. We'd need to negotiate the terms, of course. That would probably take 18 to 24 months, but it's much faster than the traditional conquest route, which our legal team estimates would take between 700 and 12,000 years to complete properly." 700 to 12,000 years? Well, the timeline depends on how many jurisdictions contest your claims. Some of the smaller municipalities can be pretty litigious. There's a property dispute in New Hampshire that's been ongoing since 1762. Zar'thex looked at his assembled officers. They looked back at him with expressions of universal exhaustion. "Fine. Send me the merger documents." "Great. I'm emailing you Form M1 now. It's only 179 pages, and most of it is pretty straightforward. You'll need to provide financial statements for the hegemony for the past 5 years, a list of all current assets including star systems and military vessels, and proof of insurance. Oh, and you'll need to register with the Better Business Bureau." The what? Part 6. The merger process. The next 6 months were a masterclass in human bureaucracy. The Federal Trade Commission required the hegemony to submit detailed financial records. These needed to be translated into generally accepted accounting principles, which apparently were not actually accepted by several dozen other regulatory bodies that had their own accounting standards. The hegemony's practice of resource allocation by military conquest was flagged as a potential antitrust violation. Their organizational structure, supreme leader with absolute authority over all subordinates, needed to be converted into corporate governance with a board of directors, shareholder meetings, and quarterly earnings reports. The fact that they'd conquered 88 other civilizations triggered a review by the Committee on Foreign Investment, which needed to verify that the hegemony wasn't under the control of a hostile foreign power. The irony was not lost on Zar'thex. "We are the hostile foreign power," he shouted at his screen during one particularly frustrating video conference. "Right, but you're trying to become a friendly foreign power through this merger," explained a patient human from the Department of Commerce. "That's why we need to do the review. It's circular, I know, but that's how the process works." The tax situation was even worse. The IRS needed to classify the hegemony's income from conquered worlds. Were they a military organization, a corporation, a government? Each classification had different tax implications and filing requirements. "Can't we just pay whatever you want and move on?" Zar'thex pleaded. "It's not about the payment, it's about the proper categorization," the IRS representative explained. "If we classify you incorrectly, it could trigger an audit, and audits can take 3 to 7 years. We're trying to avoid extra paperwork here." Then there was the environmental review. The EPA needed to assess the potential environmental impact of integrating Earth into the hegemony. This required detailed information about the hegemony's environmental practices, which led to the discovery that the Korvians had never actually tracked their environmental impact across 88 star systems. "You're going to need to conduct a comprehensive environmental survey of all hegemony-controlled territory," the EPA official said. "We can't approve a merger with an organization that doesn't meet basic environmental reporting standards. That would take decades." "I know it's frustrating, but there's a workaround. You could commit to implementing our environmental standards across all hegemony operations. Then we could approve the merger contingent on future compliance." "Fine, we'll implement your standards." "Great! I'm sending you the EPA's Guide to Environmental Compliance. It's about 12,000 pages, but don't worry, most of it is appendices. You really only need to read the first 8,000 pages. Part 7. The Hearings. By month 8, the merger had attracted public attention on Earth, which meant hearings. Zar'thex found himself testifying before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, the UN General Assembly, and the EU Parliament. Each hearing followed the same pattern. He would explain the hegemony's intentions, politicians would ask questions, and nothing would be resolved. "Commander Zar'thex," asked a senator from Montana, "can you guarantee that this merger won't result in job losses for American workers?" "Aye. We're not planning to change Earth's employment because I have 17 letters from constituents expressing concern about alien competition for jobs. What's the hegemony's policy on work visas for Korvians who want to relocate to Earth? We haven't thought about... And what about Montana specifically? We're a rural state. We can't compete with advanced alien technology. Will the hegemony commit to maintaining agricultural subsidies? I'm not familiar with your agricultural... I'll take that as a no. This merger is clearly bad for Montana farmers." At the UN, a representative from Brazil asked, "Will the hegemony respect existing international treaties?" "Which treaties?" "All of them. There are approximately 6,000 treaties currently in force." "I would need to review." "So you're saying the hegemony might violate international agreements?" "No, I'm saying I don't know what all 6,000... The chair notes that the witness is refusing to commit to treaty compliance. At the EU Parliament, someone asked him to explain the hegemony's position on data privacy under GDPR, a question so complex that Zar'thex's translator actually crashed. Through it all, Susan Mendoza sat beside him, coaching him through the process. "You're doing great," she whispered during a break in the Senate hearing. "Only 4 more committees to go." "How do you people get anything done?" Zar'thex hissed. "Very slowly," she admitted, "but very thoroughly. By the time a decision is made, everyone has had their say, all the objections have been addressed, and the paperwork is immaculate. It's not efficient, but it's stable. It's maddening." "That too." Part 8. The Opposition. Not everyone on Earth was supportive of the merger. A coalition of activist groups formed something called Humans Against Alien Acquisition, which launched a public awareness campaign about the dangers of being absorbed into an interstellar hegemony. They filed 317 separate legal challenges to the merger, each requiring individual responses. They organized protests, which required permits, which led to counter-protests from pro-merger groups, better management from outer space, which required their own permits, which conflicted with the original permits, requiring a mediation process. The courts became involved, multiple courts, federal courts, state courts, international courts, and somehow a small claims court in Delaware that claimed jurisdiction based on a technicality involving the UN's corporate registration. Each legal challenge required the hegemony to submit responses, which required lawyers, which required Zar'thex to explain Korvian legal principles to human attorneys, who then had to translate those principles into human legal frameworks. Your Honor, one of his lawyers argued before a federal judge, the hegemony's conquest protocols are similar to Earth's eminent domain principles. The hegemony takes territory for the greater good of the collective, with compensation provided in the form of technology and protection. Counselor, the judge replied, eminent domain requires just compensation determined by fair market value. What's the fair market value of Earth? The lawyer turned to Zar'thex, who turned to his economic advisor, who turned to his science officer, who shrugged all four of his shoulder equivalents. We'll need to get back to you on that, Your Honor. Take your time. I have a busy docket. We can reconvene in 6 months. Meanwhile, HFY filed a Freedom of Information Act request demanding all documentation related to the merger. The hegemony, not being a U.S. government agency, wasn't technically subject to FOIA requests, but the State Department was, which meant they had to produce all correspondence with the hegemony. This resulted in 70,000 pages of documents, mostly consisting of form submissions and email chains about form submissions. Someone actually read all 70,000 pages and discovered that in Form M1, Appendix 7, Section 42, Subsection D, the hegemony had accidentally indicated that they were a for-profit entity rather than a governmental organization. This single checkbox error invalidated 4 months of paperwork. I want to speak to whoever invented forms, Zar'thex said quietly, his eye stalks drooping with exhaustion. I want to speak to them so I can thank them for creating the most effective defensive weapon in galactic history. Part 9. The Negotiation. By month 13, both sides were desperate to finish the process. The hegemony high command was furious with Zar'thex for taking so long to conquer a primitive world. His fleet was running low on supplies, and several ships had reported malfunctions because nobody had expected to spend more than a year in Earth orbit. Earth's governments were tired of the uncertainty. The merger was disrupting markets, confusing voters, and generating truly enormous amounts of paperwork that was overflowing filing cabinets and storage servers worldwide. Susan Mendoza arranged a private meeting between Zar'thex and a special negotiating team assembled from the UN, U.S. State Department, and representatives from 20 other nations. Let's be honest with each other, began Ambassador Chen from the UN. This isn't working. Agreed, Zar'thex said immediately. You can't conquer us through military force because you can't navigate our administrative systems. We can't reject your merger because you technically haven't violated any regulations. You've just gotten lost in them. We're at an impasse. What do you propose? Ambassador Chen smiled. A compromise. You've spent the past year learning about Earth's bureaucratic systems. You've seen how they work, or don't work, depending on your perspective. What if we hired the hegemony as consultants? Consultants? Yes, Earth clearly needs better organizational systems. We have overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting regulations, inefficient processes. The hegemony has successfully governed 88 star systems. You must have some expertise in administration and organization. Zar'thex considered this. You want us to help you streamline your bureaucracy? In exchange for access to your technology, trade relationships, and a seat on the Hegemony Council, Earth becomes an autonomous partner rather than a conquered territory. We maintain our sovereignty. You get what you originally wanted, access to our resources and population, and everyone saves face. The High Command wanted Earth subjugated, not consulted. Commander, Ambassador Chen said gently, you've been orbiting our planet for 13 months filling out forms. I think we're past traditional subjugation. This is what we call finding a win-win solution. Zar'thex looked at his officers, who had been present for every excruciating moment of the past year. They looked back at him with expressions that clearly said, please, for the love of all that is holy, let this end. What would this consulting arrangement entail? Form C-14, Intergovernmental Consulting Agreement? Susan said, pulling up a document. It's only 19 pages, and I've already filled out most of it. We could have this finalized in 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks, Zar'thex repeated. After 13 months, 3 to 4 weeks sounded like paradise. Plus the standard 6 to 8 week review period, Susan added. Of course. Part 10. The Solution. The Korvian Earth Administrative Partnership was announced 3 months later, after the appropriate review periods, committee approvals, and public comment sessions. Under the agreement, the hegemony would provide technical assistance to Earth governments in streamlining their administrative processes. In exchange, Earth would share its scientific knowledge, cultural exports, and most importantly, teach the hegemony everything they'd learned about bureaucratic defense. You're weaponizing your bureaucracy? Zar'thex asked Susan during the signing ceremony. We prefer the term sharing best practices, she replied. But yes, essentially. The hegemony has encountered other aggressive species in the galaxy, right? Imagine if you could defeat them, not with weapons, but with forms. The idea was brilliant in its absurdity. Zar'thex had spent the past year learning that Earth's bureaucratic systems, while maddening, were nearly impenetrable to outside forces. They created layers of defense that no military force could overcome because they transformed conquest from a military problem into an administrative one. Any hostile force that wanted to control Earth would need to master its bureaucratic systems. And by the time they did, they'd either give up or become so entangled in the paperwork that they'd be effectively neutralized. We've been developing these systems for thousands of years, Ambassador Chen explained. Every civilization that ever existed on Earth contributed something to the bureaucracy. Roman record-keeping, Chinese imperial examinations, Byzantine administrative structures, Islamic legal frameworks, European parliamentary procedures, American regulatory agencies, all of it layered on top of each other, creating something that's incredibly resilient precisely because it's incredibly complex. It's genius, Zar'thex admitted. Maddening, but genius. Thank you. We think of it as institutional self-defense. No empire lasts forever, but paperwork is eternal. The signing ceremony itself took 6 hours, as each of the 193 UN member states needed to individually sign the agreement, and several countries insisted on making statements that needed to be translated into multiple languages and entered into the official record. But when it was finally done, Zar'thex felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Relief. Epilogue. 1 year later. Fleet Commander Zar'thex, now Senior Administrative Consultant Zar'thex, sat in his office at the newly established Bureau of Interspecies Cooperation in Brussels. His walls were decorated with frame forms. The first XP14 he'd ever submitted, the corrected M1 that had taken 4 months to fix, and a novelty certificate that read, I survived Earth's bureaucracy. Susan Mendoza appeared in his doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. Morning, Zar. We've got a situation. He looked up from the grant application he was reviewing. Form GA7, request for funding for cross-species cultural exchange programs. What kind of situation? The Valorian Empire just entered the solar system. They're demanding Earth's surrender. Standard military subjugation protocol. Zar'thex felt his mandibles click into what humans would recognize as a smile. Have they made contact yet? Yes, they spoke with General Webb. He transferred them to my office. And I sent them Form XP14. How long do you think they'll last? Susan considered this. The Valorians are known for their efficiency and direct approach to problem solving. I'd give them 2 months before they start negotiating. I'll take that bet. I say 3 weeks. They seem impatient. You're on? 2 weeks later, the Valorian Emperor himself called Zar'thex directly. How did you do it? The Emperor demanded. We have conquered 600 worlds. We have shattered entire civilizations. But these humans and their forms. I know, Zar'thex said sympathetically. I know. They asked for our insurance information. For an invasion. Did you fill out Form XP-14C? It's 40 pages long, and you need to attach Form XP-14D. I saw that. The environmental impact assessment. How am I supposed to know the environmental impact of a military invasion I haven't even conducted yet? Zar'thex pulled up a document on his screen. I'm sending you Form C-14, Intergovernmental Consulting Agreement. Believe me, Emperor, it's much easier than trying to conquer Earth. Trust me on this. But the shame, the dishonor, we are the Valorian Empire. I was Fleet Commander of the Korvian Hegemony. We'd conquered 88 worlds. Earth didn't defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with process. There's no shame in that. It's actually rather impressive once you accept it. A long silence followed. Then, can you help us fill out this Form C-14? That's what consultants are for, Emperor. That's what consultants are for. As Zar'thex ended the call, he looked out his window at the Earth below. Somewhere down there, 1 million bureaucrats were processing forms, stamping documents, and filing reports. They didn't know it, but they were operating the most effective planetary defense system in the known galaxy. Not a single weapon fired, not one city destroyed, just an endless, inexorable tide of paperwork that could drown entire armadas. Humanity had discovered the ultimate truth of the universe. Entropy increases, civilizations fall, but bureaucracy endures forever. And in that endurance, paradoxically, lay their greatest strength. Zar'thex's communicator beeped. An email from Susan. I win the bet. You owe me lunch. He clicked his mandibles in amusement and got back to work. Form GS7 wasn't going to review itself. After all, there were procedures to follow. The end.